Hello everybody and welcome back. Thank you very much for joining me. My name is Deborah Hatswell and you're listening to BBR Investigations. Tonight I have a report of a terrifying creature in the Wanstead Park area of London. Now, many avid cryptozoologists will already know of the other creature reports that have happened and were reported in the area. They're very well documented. But the one I'm sharing with you tonight is a new report that came into BBR very recently. BBR investigator Steve White went out to the area using the map coordinates that were supplied by our witness Ian James. I spoke with Ian myself and he shared as many details of the events of that night that he could remember. I've added a link to Ian's photography website as the images he takes have a magical feel to them. So let's go back in time to 1989 when four ordinary lads were night fishing and they saw an impossible creature that stalked them through the night until the early morning. The Wanstead Park creature. Hi Debbie, I've just stumbled upon the BBR website and your contact details. During some research into a strange sighting that I had as an 18-year-old back in 1989 in Wanstead Park, London. I was in a conversation with a friend, an accompanying witness, and we were reminiscing about the old days, and the subject of this sighting came up. My friend and I both agreed that it's something that not only we will never forget, but something that we both think about regularly to this day. As I say, this happened in Wanstead Park. I was in my late teens. I don't know the exact date, but it would have been in 1989. At the time, I'd been out earlier in the evening playing squash for a few hours at Barking Sports Centre with a few mates. We were into keeping fit and on a health kick. So even though none of us drank any alcohol after we played squash that night, we went to our local pub, the Duke's Head, for a bit. Not wanting to cut the night short, as it was a Friday night, we decided to go night fishing on one of the ornamental lakes in Wanstead Park. I went home about 9 p.m. to get my tackle, and I asked my dad if I could borrow his good torch. He wasn't keen on me taking it, and he warned me not to run the battery out, but in the end he said I could. So we went up there in Paul's car, which was a souped-up Mark II Escort. We went to the area we call the back car park, and that's the one just off Overton Drive, E11. And that road is the one close to the golf course. Wanstead Park is similar to most town parks in the UK. It used to be the grounds of a huge mansion known as Wanstead House, and that was built in the 18th century. But there'd been a manor house on that spot that dates back to the 14th century. The house is gone now, as it was sold off to pay the debts in 1924 of the family. But some of the grounds and the way they were laid out still remain. The gateposts of the house remain, and there is a meadow that sweeps down to the ornamental lakes known as the Glade. That was at the front of where the house sat. We walked around the ornamental lakes until we got to the tree line. We went down into the underbrush, about 300 metres from an old derelict boathouse folly known as the Grotto. We got the rod set up and we just sat around telling jokes as the fish weren't biting and we were all getting a bit bored. It was in the early hours of the morning by this time, and we just decided to go off on a mooch and wander around the park and the lakes. We were walking on the gravel path, which was about 10 to 15 feet wide back then. It looked smaller now on Google Earth. The path came to a fork that would take us back to where we'd been fishing. There were four of us. I was on the left-hand side with my torch. Paul and Neil were in the middle with no torches, and then my other mate, also called Paul, was on the right-hand side with his torch. As we reached the apex of the fork, I was just swinging my torch along when it lit up these two eyes. They were big eyes, not like a fox or a cat. They were bigger than a human eye. I lived in Sweden for a number of years in the north, and we lived up on one of the mountains, and you would sometimes see eye shine from moose caught in our headlights, and these eyes were like that. They were not 6 or 7 feet off the ground. They were more like 3.5, 4 feet off the ground. We were still walking towards it, and we got as close as about 30 feet away from wherever it was. What I'm going to explain next all happened simultaneously. I still had my torch shining on it, and Paul did the same. We got a really good look at it with both torch beams on it, and it was hiding in the bushes. It was just standing there looking at us. And as I said, "What the fuck is that?" my other two friends ran at it. They shouted, "Get it!" But as soon as they'd taken 2 strides towards this thing, you could see it more clearly. Standing there is what I would describe as a primate of some kind. You could see its eyes, and the fur around them was really dark. But in the torchlight, it had a red tinge like an orangutan. If you see a cat and it's a black cat, its coat's all one colour. But as it walks into the light or the sunlight, there's almost a reddish colour to it. Well, it was like that. The way it was standing showed that its arms and torso were way longer than its legs. I don't know if it was its true height, or if it was hunched over or even kneeling down, because I couldn't see its feet. They were in the grass. Its whole body was covered in fur, and the length of the fur was similar to that of an orangutan. As I said, this all happened in a second. As my 2 mates ran towards it, pandemonium happened. At that point, this thing let out a cry, and it was a cross between a really throaty growl and a hiss. And it bared its teeth, and all I can remember is those canines. They were not close together like a dog's teeth. They were spaced further apart like a human's are. Its face was also flatter than a primate's. And at that point, my 2 mates who had run at it slipped onto the gravel and ended up on the floor. I grabbed Neil, and Paul grabbed Paul, and we all turned to run. We were all running back up this path, and it chased us. It didn't come out onto the path and chase us. It stayed within the bushes while it kept up with us. You could see the bushes moving as it went through there. It didn't make any other vocal sounds at this point. We just kept running down that path until we got to the perch pond. We kept running across the heath in the direction of the building known as the temple. And when we were about halfway across the heath, I told everyone to get down on the floor. It was terrifying. We were all upset, and Neil was sobbing. In fact, we were all almost sobbing. It was one of the scariest moments of my life. We had to turn the torches out and just lay there. We were there for at least an hour, and this thing never left. It didn't come out into the open again, but you could hear it moving around in the underbrush. Every now and then it would get a tree or a bush and just shake it violently. I would say it was a territorial show of strength. That's what it felt like to me. And then we realised we'd have to go back. We'd have to pass where it was to get back to the fishing gear and then the car. Both of those areas meant going back, but we didn't have a choice. There would have been hell to pay if I didn't bring the tackle box back and the rods, as some of my dad's gear was still in there too. I remember foraging around for a thick branch I could use to protect myself as we set off back to the fishing spot. I knew that was probably useless, but it made me feel a bit better knowing I had something to defend myself with. I don't know how we got back to the car. As soon as I got home, I woke up Mum and Dad and I told them what had happened. I was hyper by the time I got home. My adrenaline was running. I was shaking. My dad was having none of it, but my mum was more inclined to believe us. She asked my mates what happened and they confirmed it. We hung around in a crowd back then. Most of our mates thought we were, messing about or taking a piss. So a little over a week later, we put a plan together to go back out there and, a few of us. There's probably about 20 of us, and we set off for the park with the idea of hunting this thing down. It didn't matter how many of us there were, or what we carried with us. As soon as we got a few hundred yards into the park, our collective resolve cracked, and we legged it and went back to the car. I have puzzled about this event for years, and for all I've told some people, it isn't something I've shared a lot. Until recently, I didn't think anyone else here in the UK had seen something like it. But I thought I'd have a look on Google, and that led me to a few newspaper reports of a hairy creature in the area. And that's when I contacted you, Deb. I don't know how those boys made it out of there alive, in all honesty, with their mental health intact. That must have been absolutely terrifying for them. I have spoken with Ian, and I've introduced him to a number of other witnesses that have been through similar or the same kind of experience. One of the things that people tend to find hard is that these cryptid-like creatures are often seen around urban places. Most of our urban places in the UK have at least one or two river valleys that run alongside them or through them, and they enable anybody, creatures or humans, to get around at night without being seen. So I'd like to share with you a selection of reports of strange ape or bear-like creatures, even a dogman, that has been seen and reported in the same or surrounding area. Some of them are also described as having reddish type hair or fur, just like Ian explained. I believe Wanstead Heath's Green Corridor starts north of Epping Forest, and it follows the course of the River Lee, as there are reports like this all along the Lee Valley. I have a report from Epping Forest, quite similar. It also involved two local boys fishing in a local pond when they were terrorised by an invisible creature that approached them from behind. This had such an effect on them that one of those boys became a paranormal investigator with at least 50 years of hands-on research trying to solve what happened to him that day. But first, let's look at the immediate area, Wanstead Park, and the Hackney Marsh area that runs alongside it. And then we'll fan out from there and look at some of those reports. Now, in 2008, in Wanstead, a dark bear-like creature was reported by a trainee fitness instructor known as Michael Kent, and he was stunned when he saw a hairy dark creature during an evening fishing trip in the Hollow Ponds area of Epping Forest on the border between Wanstead and Leytonstone. So once again, we've got three people out fishing at night when something is seen and startles them. Mr. Kent, who was 18 at the time in 2008, said, "I was there with my dad and my brother. I was walking over to where my brother was when I heard this rustling sound. I looked over and I saw this strange dark creature. It was a figure really, it resembled a bear. It was hunched over and I could see it had really long hair on its back. I think it must have heard me and it scampered off into the bushes after a couple of seconds. It was getting dark, but I still managed to get a good look at it. It was about 4 foot tall, so it was too small to be a human, but not the right shape to be a deer. It didn't have long legs or anything like that. I've been fishing in the area since I was 5 years old. I've seen deer, dogs, and even a cow before, but never anything like this." Just 1 week later, a local woman shared her experience with a similar creature. Irene Dainter, who lives in Love Lane, was left shaking in fear after she came face to face with a hairy creature, which surprised her in the street. Mrs. Dainty told The Guardian she was absolutely convinced that what she saw was not human or a normal species of animal life. And she said, "I'd just come out of my flat, and just as I turned the corner, I saw this hairy thing. It came out of nowhere. I really don't want to see it again. It was about 4 feet tall, with really big feet, and it looked straight at me with animal eyes. Then it leapt straight over the wall, with no trouble at all, and went off into the garden of the Three Jolly Wheelers pub." She went on, "I was so terrified that I went round to my neighbour's house and I told her what happened, and she couldn't believe it, and she asked if I'd been drinking. But I said, of course I hadn't. It was only 3 p.m. I wonder if they saw the same creature, but 7 days apart, both give the same description. I mean, odds are, maybe they did." Now, our next report comes from a very good friend of mine. We met many years ago when she first reached out to share her experience with me, and we've been friends ever since. The flat she lived in at the time is only a stroll from Wanstead Park, and the creature that visited her also had a reddish tinge to its coat. Now, the witness said, "This happened to me some years ago now, Deb, when myself and my husband lived in a flat in E12. It was my husband's place before we married. We lived on the top floor of an old Victorian terrace row of houses. My husband was older than me and he worked nights on the railway back then, so I was often alone at night. At the back of the flat was the kitchen and the bathroom, and a really old balcony that looked out onto the back garden. It was in a bad state of repair, so my husband took it down and dismantled it for safety reasons because it was rotten and it was dangerous. Before we got the new one fitted, we had a temporary ladder up, and the balcony was above the first floor back door to the flat downstairs. So this night I'd gone to bed as normal, and I had a really lucid dream that felt so real. I dreamed a few of my friends were here, and we were sitting in the lounge, and a 7'8" black man came walking into the room. We all just sat there, terrified. Every one of us was scared to death as he slowly walked around us. The hair on my neck was tingling, and I whispered to the others, "Don't look up, don't look at him," and nobody did. He sort of circled us, and then he melted into the corner opposite the door. I then got up, suddenly not scared. I went down to the kitchen to put the kettle on. I don't know why. It was as if I knew I was safe around him somehow. He followed me and he walked down the corridor as I did into the kitchen, and as I was fixing the kettle, he just stood there. He was standing behind me and I saw him briefly. I didn't want to make eye contact, so I quickly looked at his chest for a second. The colour of his hair was like that of a red setter dog. The hair was smooth and sleek, and it covered a massively muscled chest. I'm there somehow calm as anything, just making tea in my dream, and he spoke to me. And he spoke to me in my head. I heard him clearly, and I understood what he said to me. He apologised for being in my house and explained he had no other choice. He said something along the lines of he was sorry, but they had no other choice than to stop here for the night, as his wife had just had a baby. I said it was okay, I understood, it wasn't a problem. Then his wife appeared. She was a smaller figure, but she was still massively muscled, and she came walking into the kitchen from the little corridor, and she had a tiny baby in her arms. She didn't speak, but she held up the baby for me to see. He then spoke to me again in my head and said, "Someone tried to get in here last night. They were trying to get inside." But I went raw, and he made a massive kind of roar. He said, "I scared them off." I thanked him, and then I woke up. I told my husband about my Yeti dream, as that's the only thing I could think of to call him. We were both in the garden the next day, and there was a distinct line of human footprints going up through my borders almost to the back door. I reckon someone certainly was in my garden heading for the ladder at some point in the night and was scared away by a loud roar. Now, the idea that a huge hairy wild man and his family visited a home in E12 for some is far-fetched. But would it surprise you to know that only across the marshes a number of people contacted the police because they also had some kind of primate come up to their window and in some cases into the homes and items were removed? This happened in Hackney in 2002. And the BBC reported it, and they said that the London police are hunting a chimpanzee that's reported to have broken into a flat and stolen some electrical equipment. Well, that turns out that they just took a watch, so I'm not really sure about the mobile equipment, unless some dodgy tenants got an insurance deal. But just a watch was stolen. Officers received reports of burglaries at separate addresses in Gore Road, Hackney, East London. A Scotland Yard spokesman said only a small item of personal property was taken. It's weird. I don't know whether to believe it or not. Resident Tony Morgan, who is the caller of the second burglary, confirmed to police that he'd seen an ape disappearing from the premises. Tony said he thought the chimpanzee may have gotten into his home, as when he got up in the morning, all the stuff was on the floor in the middle of the room. So he knows that someone got in to nick something, but whether it was connected to the chimpanzee or not, he didn't know. He said, "The bloke down the road said he'd been robbed by a chimpanzee. I just thought it was a wind-up. But when I looked at the window and the way it was open, I began to think it might be true. When the woman from the police came down to take fingerprints, she couldn't get any prints. It was all smudges. It's weird. I don't know whether to believe it or not," he said. Then, a short time later on the same morning, Mustafa Riot, 43, said that he'd been woken in his ground floor flat to find a large figure with 5-foot long hairy arms towering over him. He said, I saw this hairy black chimpanzee thing coming through the window, and it was broad and muscular. I was frightened of being bitten by it. Now, the first raid had been just 20 doors away, at a ground floor flat belonging to Gina Davidson. Nothing was taken, only the DVD player was moved, and a small watch was missing. So, 3 residents in modern times in a row of homes in central London had something with long hairy arms come into their properties and only a watch was taken. That would tell me that each flat was entered for another reason, as there was ample electrical goods, money, food, provisions. No thief worth his salt would leave any of that behind. Between Wanstead Park and the area that the police searched, there is a very strange history of hairy creatures that have been reported to the police. So once again, we have a number of boys out on their own when they encounter a hairy creature. This happened in 1981, and it's the Hackney Marsh Growling bear account. It happened on the 27th of December 1981. 4 boys came across a beast that they described as a giant, great, growling, hairy thing as they were playing in the thick snow on the marsh. 13-year-old Tommy Murray was scared stiff by the beast, which raised up onto its hind legs and growled at them. The boys scattered in horror, all slipping under a white blanket. This shocking encounter came just hours after the friends had stumbled across a mysterious set of impressions in the snow that seemed to have been made by a large animal they couldn't identify. So if you listen to that, the kids didn't call it a bear. The journalist called it a bear. The kids called it a giant, great, growling, hairy thing. Now, soon after the incident, more than 50 police with dogs, marksmen and a helicopter scoured the area. But despite the strange set of tracks being discovered, there was no sign of the animal. The chief inspector did say, although I didn't see the boys myself, I'm reliably informed that they were very frightened by what they saw. They were not hoaxers, although of course that doesn't mean that they've not been hoaxed. Then stories quickly began to circulate that maybe it was a man in a suit, some kind of ape or bear suit, despite the lack of human tracks in the snow. 3 sets of bear-like prints were also found. One batch was on the island, which had a perimeter fence and a locked gate. However, despite the watered-down theories of the police, something weird was definitely going on. A year previous to this, in the River Lee, 2 bear carcasses were discovered. The animals had been decapitated, and no one found out how they got there. Then, in 2023, I received a report from a man who was out on the marshes when he saw what he described as a Dogman. He said, I'm from London, originally born and bred. When I was a young man, I was always over at Hackney Marshes with my girlfriend. One night, we were having a drink over in the marsh, and it got dark. The only way back to the River Lee was over a large old abandoned factory footings, which made of concrete and they're about 10 feet off the ground. My girlfriend was drunk, so I had to carry her over those footings, which were about 5 feet wide. As I'm walking with her in my arms, I see what I thought was a 7-foot-tall man just standing there. This figure was about 50 feet away from me at this point, and then it leapt onto part of the concrete structure and just hung there for about 5 seconds. Then, without warning, it just dropped down into the long grass and bushes and was gone. As I walked past it, I knew it was still nearby watching me. As I've got older, I've come to realise that wasn't a man, and the leap it made would have broken a normal man's legs. I'm 55 now, I live in Lancashire, and I lost my urge to enter any woods or places like that a long time ago. On the back of this, I then received a report from a YouTube listener who is also local to this green corridor, and he said, I've lived in Epping Forest for over 10 years now. I've also fished once on an overnight stay with a mate. The place we fished was a lake called Wake Lake. I believe that the forest is weird at night, and this may stem from Druids wandering through the forest making all manner of noises. As I mentioned earlier, there's a case from Epping Forest where 2 boys fishing at night have an impossible encounter that they never forget. Just like Ian and his friend, the boy in this case is still investigating what happened to him 49 years later. This is Chris Huff's personal experience, and it happened at the suicide pond in 1974. And he said, I had an experience with a friend when we were fishing in the Blackweir Pond area, known to locals as the Lost Pond or even the Suicide Pond, as it's an eerie place to be in the daytime, let alone at night, with only a pocket knife for protection. It was a strange place at the best of times. I'd been to that area so many times as a boy with friends. We'd fish late or just play as boys do, come home when we were hungry. The Lost Pond is in the area of Lawton Camp within Epping Forest. The pond's hidden away in the middle of the forest. It's a hard location to get into. It's not visible to any passers-by. There are large trees and bushes all around it, so that's how it got its name, but not its reputation. Even the pond itself has an eerie feel. It has a strange circular pond where we used to fish at night for carp. I say strange because it had a local and well-known reputation at school as a suicide pond. It's always felt dark and solemn when you're there. And it's said normal, sane individuals would inexplicably be overcome with grief or sadness and then throw themselves into the water and drown for no reason. Well, that was a local story at least, but we were not deterred from fishing as it was a good little spot. It was quiet and out of the way. Not many people fished it other than us, so it was always a place we'd head to. We'd go there or the Gravels. It was our two favourite spots. On one of these fishing trips, we headed to the pond and fished it for a while. It'd gotten late in the evening. It would have been back in the mid-1970s. We'd encamped on the bank of the pond in an area of clear gravel and a little away from the forest as it's much easier to cast off from there. We placed the fishing umbrellas behind us to form a windbreak and preserve some warmth as it was getting cold at this point. So we bait and we cast off and the floats are in the water and we sit with our torches shining on them in the hopes of a bob or two. We fished for a couple of hours chatting away about this and that, feeling fine and enjoying ourselves. We're sitting there in a quiet with just a gentle bob that could be heard and the woods were quiet, when from behind us there was a noise and it was coming out of the forest. There came this loud shuffle in the leaves, like a loud thump or a heavy thud, and then a thump thud. And as we listened, we heard a really loud, extremely loud thud. Then after a second, there was another thump, and then one after another. They seemed to be getting closer to us each time. The next thud was the scariest of all, and it wasn't leaves we heard when it landed. This time, you could hear the sound of the gravel being crunched behind us. So whatever it was, it had come out of the forest, and it was heading to us, getting closer all of the time. The steps were about a second and a half apart. Thud, thump, thud. As strange as this may sound, it sounded to me as though a very heavy man had kind of hopped or jumped out of the forest and was coming towards us. Or something very heavy on two legs, unseen, was coming our way. We were looking at each other dumbfounded, with a mix of fear and annoyance at first that this might be one of the Epping Forest pervs that so many people tell you about. So we grabbed the torches and the rod rests. That's all we had, really, to defend ourselves with, except some tiny sheath knives for just cutting the line. So they would have to do as weapons. We both stepped out from the umbrellas at the same time in a show of strength to do battle in the best schoolboy tradition. After a count of 3, 1, 2, 3, we both jumped from behind the umbrellas ready to attack. But there's nobody there. There's nobody running back into the trees trying to hide. No sign of anyone. Just empty space wherever we looked. There was no sign that anybody had been there, and no sounds from the surrounding forest to indicate that someone was running back that way, escaping from us. What could be that heavy and yet vanish that quickly and silently? Understandably, we'd both had enough at this point, and in absolute terror, we packed up quickly, faster than I've ever done so before or since, and we ran for it. Well, we quickly walked through the dark forest carrying all our gear, our torches pointing everywhere. just in case we had the bank sticks and sheet knives at the ready. It was so dark in there, you couldn't see what was up just ahead or behind. It was terrifying. I still have no idea what could have made the noise we heard. What would thud or thump like that? You could feel it on the ground, it was so loud. Suffice to say that although this occurred some 50 years ago, it remains vivid in my memory, even now, because of the complete terror that I felt at the time. I will never get over that night, and I no doubt will always remember it. And even to this day, I can't work out what could have been that heavy to make that much noise. You could feel those thumps on the ground. Now, in 1989, when Ian had his encounter with an ape-like creature in Wanstead Park, he had no way of knowing that a similar dark-coloured creature was reported by several people just north along the Green Corridor in the same year. This time, the witnesses described this creature as a Shuck. It's said that the demon dog was seen in the summer of 1989 around Buckhurst Hill, Essex. The creature alarmed a trio of 17-year-old boys walking to a party through a local graveyard. You've seen the coincidences here, folk. And soon afterwards, a motorist had a Shuck jump on the bonnet of her car, and each and every witness stated that the Shuck only had one eye. Then we have the report of the Romford red-eyed creature. This witness said, there's an area around Lambourne End, a bridge, and it's still very rural. But it was even quieter 30 years ago, back when I was a teenager. There wasn't a lot to do at night, so we'd just drive around in cars. One night I was on the back of my mate's motorbike. We were coming down Hole Lane towards Lambourne End. He was a safe rider, was taking his time, and especially with me on the pillion. He leaned back at one point and said, "Did you see that?" And I said, "No, I've not seen anything." I asked what he'd spotted. I was expecting him to say some unusual animals. You'd often see foxes and such like out there. Instead of answering, he said, "Hang on," and he opened the bike up. He was speeding down the lane, which was totally unusual for him. We didn't slow down till I got to my house. I was a bit surprised and I asked him what on earth was going on. And he said he'd seen something big, very black, just a huge dark lump of a shape with bright eyes that reflected in his headlight. It was on the field edge to our left, and as we got close, it changed its stance and it dropped down, kind of to the road edge, but it kept itself hidden behind the hedge, and he could still see its eyes. That and the size of this thing are what stood out to him the most. He said it was huge, and what bothered him more than anything was it moved towards us and not away from us. That's why he sped off on the bike. We never did find out what it was that he'd seen, but I still remember everything about that night and how worried and shook up my friend was. A few years later, that night came up in conversation with another friend, and he told me about a time when he was out in his Mini, which was fitted with rally spotlights on the front. He was driving up some lane towards Abridge where we were on the bike. He explained something he couldn't describe, but said was a hulking, huge, darker than the night thing crossed the road ahead of him. He couldn't make it out clearly, and his lights didn't quite reach the figure to illuminate it. But as he drove past the spot it was standing, he saw her eyes looking at him in the hedge. Strangely, and to add to this mystery, this thing was seen again. It was around the same time by another group of friends who were staying in a nearby field on Hole Lane. They'd camped in a few buses. They said one night when it was dark and they were getting ready to turn in for the night, they all heard a massive skidding of brakes and thought a car had crashed in the lane. So they rushed out and went down the lane to look in case someone needed help. They reached the area just as the car screeched off. Standing in the car lights and silhouetted by the field gate was what they described as a huge black shape that was as wide as two big blokes put together, and this shape stood about 7 feet tall. She went on to say, "I found it interesting that 3 local folk that I knew had experiences down there. I wonder how many others have too. Funnily enough, I'm 50 now, and I still don't like driving down Hole Lane. I go the long way around every time." Over the years, the reports have continued to come in from this area. It was only a few weeks ago that I was contacted by a lady who shared her husband's experience with me, and that happened in 2016, and she said, "I'm new to the site, and seeing your videos have just recently brought a memory to hand from not that long ago. It was around 2016, I guess. My husband was leaving to go home after dropping me at my sister's flat in Erith in Kent. When my husband was driving, he saw something he can only describe as being like a hairy man, wolf-type being. The funny thing is, this was in broad daylight. Although the street was empty as he drove past this strange-looking creature, he seemed no one else saw it, and so he presumed. He explained that he was driving slowly down the road when this figure suddenly appeared, across the road going in the opposite direction than my husband was taking. He described it as being up on two legs, and it was walking in a strange way. It was slightly leaning backwards as he was moving forward. At first he thought he was seeing things. A car came out from the corner road, and as he took his eyes off this strange being, he looked back to see where it was, and it had gone. From what I heard from one of the videos posted on YouTube, there is some speculation that their fur could have some kind of camouflage, or that it refracts the light. I think this would maybe explain why he saw it, but no one else did. It hid itself until using its own ability to do so. My husband did ring me when he got home to tell me what he saw. I was amused because on the TV news that night there were some sightings of a big cat or even a lion that had escaped. The place it had supposedly escaped from, I can't remember now where this was, but it felt a little odd that this was aired on the evening news at the time that he'd seen it. The story gets stranger, as while I was away with my sister on a short break on Southern Coastline Seaside Resort, we had further strange sightings and heard noises at night on the roof of the hotel we were staying in. This happened within a couple of days of my husband's sighting. Now, how could that be when the sightings we had were much further away from where my sister lived? I have no explanation of how this could happen. It still remains a mystery to me. Furthermore, going back to the early 60s, I remember my father and my brother, who'd been out for the evening probably at the local pub. While walking home together, they were chased by some huge dog. My father had said that it was a black-looking dog, but nothing like he'd ever seen before because of its size. They both made it home safely, and my father and my brother were scared stiff. My father called it a devil dog. I was too young at the time to understand what that meant. There have been many sightings in that area over the years, with woods and grassy areas all over the place. I just wanted to share that because there's definitely something that people are out there seeing. Now, if we look at either side of the River Leak Valley, there are reports all over it. I think of one that springs to mind instantly in Kent, where a young courting couple during the war saw what she described as a flaming-haired werewolf. It's very similar in colour to what some of the people are seeing. Very similar kind of creature, up on two legs but animalistic. Now, in our last report tonight, I'm sharing one of Chris Huff's strangest cases, and this happened in Folkestone. And I've added it because it is the weirdest, probably one of the weirdest cases I've ever heard. And that's the case of the cat-headed people. Now that just conjures up the most awful things in my mind. A being that's half human and half cat. I mean, that's beyond it for me. Now, this account was reported in the mid-1990s to Chris, and he said, "I was investigating a haunting down at Felixton in Kent. And after chatting for a while with the owner, he came out with an experience he couldn't explain. And he said, 'Here's something I can't understand. Maybe you can.' Years ago, when he was a kid in the early 50s, he and his sisters were out playing in some woods near Eltham in South London. At first, all was well. They were just happily playing out when he started to feel threatened. On looking around, he saw two tall, over 6 feet, very skinny men. And they were naked or had some form of loincloth on them. They had white skin, with reddish-pink spirals painted on their bodies. But worse than that, their heads looked like that of a cat. I seem to remember him stating that they were carrying long sticks. He stated as he watched them, the pair separated and moved to what he thought was an advantage point to cut off the children's escape. So they legged it out of there Well, sadly, he said, apart from saying that there are some very crazy things going on, I couldn't tell him anything to help his understanding of what had happened at all. But I think that listening without criticising helped. Now, I've known Chris for years, many years, and some of our witnesses, whose truths you've heard tonight, have had similar accounts. Or if you like Ian, they might be new to me and we've only just started talking. But these witnesses span throughout a lifetime. We're all from different age groups, we live in different areas of the UK or the world. Yet we all recognise something in each of us when we chat. We have all witnessed the impossible. We are ordinary folk and we have seen the extraordinary. Not one of us was out that night to see something. In fact, hand on heart, I don't think any of these witnesses had heard of cryptids, other than the odd Yeti report that was probably been jokey on the telly in the UK at the time. Yet we're each still struggling to understand what happened to us. We've put hours and years of thought into it, why we saw it, and I think if I'm honest, if we'll see it again. I don't know the answers to these questions, but I find it hard to believe we are the only ones. I know out there are so many more of us thinking we're alone in this, or people who may have heard the podcast and are just not that brave enough to get in touch yet. It doesn't matter. You'll be ready in your own time. And when you are, we'll be there. So for the next few weeks, I'm going to bring you some reports. I have noticed a very worrying change. One of the reports that we did tonight mentioned about an animal following you home. Well, animals have a far better smell than humans. And I don't think that it would be a big stretch to say that they could easily follow you home. In fact, I think it's happened to me. So I'm going to bring you some reports. Now, there's a case in Aviemore where the witness stated there was just a tent between me and it, and I prepared to die that night. And then we have a report in Dorset where the creature's been seen watching children. And as I said, in Cumbria, where a witness in the case was followed home. So make sure you join me at the same time, same day next week for more stories from the BBR case files. Thanks for tuning in tonight, guys, whether you're a new listener or old. You can check out all of our other links. They're in the description below. I've also added a link in for Ian's photography site. I think you'll enjoy it. I'll be speaking to Chris in the week, and if anybody wants to talk about an experience that's happened to them or his experience at Epping, just let me know, and I shall put you both in touch. So until then, have a wonderful week. Good night, everyone.